Western Netherlands, April 29, 1945. The truck convoy rolled down streets where tulips had once grown and only weeds remained, past houses with windows empty as skull sockets, through a city that smelled of death and desperation. Sergeant James Morrison watched Dutch civilians emerge from doorways, skeletal figures, children with bellies distended from starvation, mothers who wept at the sight of American uniforms. His truck carried food, thousands of pounds of it, part of Operation Manna, the emergency relief drop that would either save these people or arrive too late. A woman collapsed at his feet, pulling a child forward, maybe 6 years old, maybe 10. Impossible to tell through the starvation. She couldn't speak. She didn't need to. The occupation had lasted 5 years, but the final winter was different. It was systematic starvation deployed as weapon, punishment for Dutch resistance, demonstration of what happened when occupied peoples supported Allied advances. When Operation Market Garden failed in September 1944, when liberation stalled at the rivers, German forces retaliated against Dutch railway workers who'd struck to support Allied operations. The punishment was comprehensive. Food shipments stopped, fuel disappeared, and Western Netherlands, the densely populated region containing Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, was cut off from agricultural areas that normally supplied it. Anna van der Meer was 32 years old, mother of 3 children in Amsterdam, wife of a man who'd been taken for forced labor in Germany 2 years earlier, without word since. She'd survived occupation through careful rationing, through black market connections, through sacrificing everything non-essential to keep her family fed. But by November 1944, the careful calculations stopped working. Food rations dropped below starvation levels. The black market dried up as even criminal networks ran out of supplies. The fuel ran out, making heating impossible as winter approached. Her children were Sophie, age 8, Peter, age 5, and baby Emma, 14 months. Sophie had been vibrant before the occupation, curious and bright, always asking questions, always moving. Now she sat listlessly, too exhausted from hunger to play, her body consuming itself to stay alive. Peter cried constantly from stomach pains, from the gnawing emptiness that no amount of tulip bulb soup could satisfy. Baby Emma had stopped crying entirely, gone silent in a way that terrified Anna more than screaming would have. By December, Amsterdam was eating anything remotely edible. Tulip bulbs became staple bitter, barely nutritious, but filling stomachs temporarily. Sugar beets stolen from fields. Pets disappeared, first from streets and from homes as people made impossible choices. The parks were stripped of grass as people searched for anything green. Trees were cut down illegally for firewood, despite German prohibitions, because freezing was as deadly as starving and the combination was claiming thousands. The death toll climbed steadily through winter. 20,000 would die before spring, most in Western Netherlands, most in January, and February, when cold combined with starvation to overwhelm bodies that had exhausted all reserves. People died in their homes and lay there for days because families lacked energy to move them and authorities lacked resources to collect them. Amsterdam's canals froze, and on the ice, people scavenged for anything frozen fish, dropped objects, things that might have value or use in economy, reduced to pure survival. Anna watched her children starving and felt powerless in ways that exceeded physical hunger. She was mother. Her role was to feed them, to protect them, to ensure their survival. But she had nothing. The rations were too small. The tulip bulbs were running out. Her own body was failing, milk drying up for Emma, strength fading to the point where climbing stairs required rest halfway up. She'd sold everything that could be sold, burned everything that could be burned, eaten everything that might provide calories. There was nothing left except waiting for liberation, for spring, for death, for whatever came first. Sergeant James Morrison was 24 years old, from Ohio, had enlisted in 1942 and fought across Europe from Normandy through Belgium into Germany. He'd seen combat death, had lost friends, had witnessed destruction that exceeded anything his small-town upbringing had prepared him for. But nothing in that experience prepared him for what Allied reconnaissance reported from Western Netherlands in April 1945. Mass starvation on scale that required immediate intervention. The strategic situation was complicated. German forces still occupied Western Netherlands, still maintained defensive positions, still technically capable of resistance. But they were cut off, surrounded by Allied advances, clearly defeated but not yet surrendered. Negotiating humanitarian access required diplomatic delicacy convincing German commanders to allow food deliveries while maintaining military pressure, arranging temporary ceasefires for relief operations, coordinating with Dutch resistance to identify need and distribution points. The negotiations happened at high levels. Eisenhower's headquarters, working with German representatives, British and American commanders developing operational plans, Dutch government in exile providing intelligence about conditions. But the execution would fall to soldiers like Morrison, men who'd been fighting Germans for years, and now had to coordinate with them to save Dutch civilians from starvation their own forces had deliberately inflicted. Operation Manna began April 29, 1945. British RAF bombers flying low over Western Netherlands, dropping food instead of explosives. Thousands of tons of supplies delivered by planes that had recently been destroying German cities. The American version, Operation Chowhound, would follow immediately. B-17 bombers repurposed as cargo planes, delivering food to designated drop zones where Dutch civilians would collect it under German supervision. Enemy forces facilitating relief for populations they'd been starving. Morrison's unit was assigned ground distribution, following the airdrops with truck convoys, delivering food directly to cities, working with Dutch officials to establish distribution centers. The assignment was strange after months of combat, surreal to be entering enemy-occupied territory not to fight, but to feed, coordinating with Germans instead of shooting them, shifting from warriors to humanitarian workers without clear transition. The briefing was stark. Captain Reynolds showed photographs from reconnaissance. Skeletal children, mass graves, streets empty of everything, including hope. He described the death toll 20,000 and counting, possibly more, since intelligence was imperfect. Certainly more if relief didn't arrive soon. He explained the operation. They'd cross into Western Netherlands under temporary truce, deliver food to designated locations, work with local authorities to ensure distribution reached those most in need. German forces had agreed to non-interference. Dutch resistance would provide security and logistics. Success required speed. Thousands were dying daily, and every hour of delay cost lives. Morrison looked at the photographs and felt something shift inside him, from soldier focused on destruction to something more complicated. Someone who'd seen too much death and now had chance to prevent more. He volunteered for the first convoy, wanting to be there, needing to do something that wasn't about destroying, but about saving, about proving that all the fighting had purpose beyond just victory. April 30th, 1945. The convoy of 15 trucks loaded with food crossed into Western Netherlands at dawn, Dutch resistance guides leading them through routes that avoided remaining German defensive positions. Morrison rode in the lead truck, watching landscape transform from battlefields to occupied territory to something worse. A place where war had passed but left famine behind, where military conflict was over, but death continued through calculated policy. The roads were empty of traffic, no fuel, no vehicles, nothing moving except occasional pedestrians who walked with the slow, careful gait of people conserving energy they didn't have. The houses were damaged from fighting, windows broken, roofs holed, but worse was the silence, the absence of life sounds that cities normally held. No children playing, no conversations, no sounds of commerce or community, just silence broken occasionally by wind through empty structures. They saw the first bodies near Leiden, 3 people lying beside the road, emaciated beyond recognition, covered with blankets by someone who'd lacked strength to bury them properly. Morrison had seen combat dead, had been hardened to death's visual reality. But these deaths were different. Not sudden violence, but slow starvation. Not soldiers who'd accepted risks, but civilians who'd been deliberately targeted. Not casualties of war, but victims of policy. The civilians who emerged as trucks passed were shocking. Morrison had read the briefings, seen the photographs, been told about starvation conditions. But nothing conveyed the physical reality of mass hunger bodies reduced to skin and bone, bellies swollen from malnutrition, limbs thin as branches, faces hollowed into skull shapes, eyes too large and faces too small, children who moved like old people and old people who barely moved at all. A woman approached the convoy as it paused, walking with cane that supported weight that couldn't have been more than 70 pounds. She spoke in Dutch that Morrison didn't understand, but her meaning was clear from gestures and desperation. She needed food. Her family needed food. Everyone needed food immediately. The Dutch resistance guide translated. She says her grandchildren haven't eaten in 3 days. She says many families are in final stages. She says you've come just in time or too late. She doesn't know which yet. The convoy continued toward Amsterdam, passing through towns where people gathered at roadsides, not threatening or demanding, but just watching with expressions that mixed hope and disbelief. Were these Americans real? Was food actually coming? After months of promises and rumors that led nowhere, was liberation finally arriving? The silence was profound. Crowds that normally would have cheered standing mute because they lacked energy for celebration could only watch and hope and try not to believe too much in case this was another false hope that would devastate when disappointed. Amsterdam's city center had been designated as main distribution point, and the convoy arrived at noon to find thousands of civilians already gathered, not rioting, not pushing, just standing in lines that had formed spontaneously. People who'd walked miles despite starvation, because this was their last chance, their final hope, the thing they'd been surviving for through 6 months of deliberate hunger. The Dutch resistance had organized the distribution with impressive efficiency despite their own starvation tables set up. Volunteers, themselves skeletal, ready to help. Priority system established to serve children and nursing mothers first, then elderly, and general population. The Americans unloaded their trucks under this guidance, stacking cases of food canned goods, flour, dried milk, sugar, fats, everything calculated to provide maximum nutrition quickly without overwhelming digestive systems that had forgotten how to process rich food. Morrison helped carry boxes to distribution tables, and the weight that seemed normal when loading felt surreal here. This single box held more food than these people had seen in months. Contained enough calories to save lives, represented abundance for world these civilians had stopped believing still existed. He placed the box on a table and looked up to see the line of people waiting, mothers holding children who looked more dead than alive, elderly men and women barely standing, teenagers who aged into something ancient through starvation, all waiting with desperate patience for food that would either save them or, for some, arrive too late for bodies that had passed beyond recovery. The first person to receive food was a mother named Helena, holding a daughter maybe 4 years old, who weighed perhaps 20 pounds, body reduced to skeleton covered by skin. Helena received canned milk, flour, sugar, a package that might have seemed modest in normal times, but here was treasure beyond measure, was life itself concentrated into supplies that could be carried. She tried to speak, to thank, but only wept, tears running down her gaunt face while she held her daughter and the food and seemed unable to believe either was real. Morrison watched this repeated hundreds of times, people receiving food and breaking down, tears flowing from eyes that seemed too dry for tears, gratitude expressed through sobs or silence or attempts at speech that failed because emotions were too large for words. Some people tried to eat immediately, desperate hunger overwhelming caution, and volunteers had to gently stop them, had to explain that eating too much too quickly would make them sick, that recovery required care, even in relief. Anna van der Meer arrived in mid-afternoon, having walked 3 miles from her apartment, carrying baby Emma and holding Sophie and Peter by their hands. She'd heard the announcement that morning American food at the city center, distribution beginning at noon, come quickly before supplies ran out. She'd spent an hour deciding whether to go, whether her children could survive the walk, whether this was real or another rumor that would end in disappointment. Finally, she decided death at home was certain, but the possibility of food was worth attempting. The walk had been agonizing. Sophie couldn't walk the full distance, so Anna had carried her part of the way, though she barely had strength to carry Emma. Peter had fallen twice, too weak to maintain balance, and Anna had helped him up with hands that shook from her own weakness. They'd rested 3 times, sitting on curbs while Anna tried to calm her breathing and summon energy that didn't exist. But they'd made it, had joined the line, had waited 2 hours while it moved slowly forward, and now she stood before an American soldier who was handing her packages of food. She looked at the food and couldn't process what she was seeing. Canned milk, she hadn't seen milk in months, had watched Emma waste away without it. Flour, real flour, wheat flour, not the sawdust mixtures that had been the only option. Canned meat, dried eggs, sugar, fats, everything her children needed to survive. She reached for the packages, and her hands wouldn't work properly, fingers shaking too badly to grasp, body refusing to function from exhaustion and disbelief. Morrison saw her struggling and helped, placing the packages in the bag she'd brought, making sure everything was secure. He looked at her children, the baby barely moving, the little boy and girl who looked like photographs from camps, skeletal children who needed immediate medical intervention as much as food. He spoke in English she didn't understand. "Your children need a doctor. We have medical teams setting up. Please take them there after you get food." The resistance translator conveyed his words, and Anna nodded, tears streaming down her face. Unable to speak, able only to hold the food bag and her children, and weep with relief that felt too large to contain. The military had brought medical teams along with food, understanding that months of starvation created health emergencies that wouldn't be resolved just by eating. The team set up in buildings near distribution points, creating emergency clinics where the most desperate cases could receive immediate treatment, intravenous fluids, medical food supplements, antibiotics for infections that bodies couldn't fight alone. Captain Sarah Mitchell was a nurse from Boston, had served in field hospitals from North Africa through Europe, had treated combat wounds and disease and everything that war inflicted on bodies. But this was different. These weren't soldiers injured in battle, but civilians systematically starved, children whose bodies were consuming themselves, elderly who were dying from deprivation rather than age. The medical training that had prepared her for surgery and trauma hadn't prepared her for this scale of malnutrition, for triage where every patient needed immediate help and resources couldn't cover everyone. The children were worst. Their bodies had prioritized survival, shutting down non-essential functions, consuming muscle and fat to protect vital organs. But there were limits to what bodies could sacrifice, and many children had reached those limits. They had edema fluid retention that made bellies swell grotesquely while limbs remained skeletal. They had skin infections from weakened immune systems. They had vitamin deficiencies that caused bleeding and weakness and neurological problems. Many were beyond recovery, had passed the point where even aggressive intervention could save them. Baby Emma was one of these border cases, possibly salvageable with immediate intensive care, possibly too far gone to recover. Mitchell examined her with professional attention that barely masked emotional response, noting the signs of severe malnutrition, the lack of subcutaneous fat, the weak pulse, the barely responsive consciousness. This child needed hospitalization, needed 4 fluids and medical nutrition and careful monitoring. But there were hundreds of similar cases, and the clinic had limited beds, limited supplies, limited capacity to save everyone. Mitchell made the call. Emma would be hospitalized, given intensive treatment, monitored constantly. If she survived the next 48 hours, her prognosis was reasonable. If she didn't stabilize quickly, her body might be too damaged for recovery. Anna listened to this assessment through the translator, trying to understand that her daughter might die despite food, arriving that starvation's damage might be too extensive to reverse. That relief had come possibly too late for Emma, even while coming in time to save thousands of others. The hospital, a repurposed school building, filled rapidly with the most critical cases. Children lying in rows of cots, receiving 4 fluids, being fed careful small amounts through feeding tubes, monitored by nurses and doctors who worked with desperate efficiency. Some children improved quickly once nutrition resumed, bodies proving resilient and capable of recovery. Others deteriorated despite treatment, systems too damaged to recover, dying in these improvised hospital beds with liberation that had come too late to save them. That first night, Morrison sat outside the distribution center, smoking a cigarette, trying to process what he'd witnessed. He'd been in combat for 3 years, had seen friends die, had taken lives himself in the war's necessity. But this was different. This was seeing the consequences of war on people who'd done nothing except exist in the wrong place, whose suffering had been deliberate and calculated, whose death had been policy rather than collateral damage. A Dutch resistance fighter named Jan sat beside him, offered him a cigarette from Morrison's own pack. Morrison had given him several earlier small gesture of sharing. Jan was maybe 45, looked 70, had lost 30 pounds during the hunger winter, had watched neighbors die while maintaining resistance operations, had guided this convoy through dangerous territory, despite barely having strength to walk. They sat in silence until Jan spoke in careful English. "Thank you. Those words are inadequate, but they're all I have. You saved my city today, not just with food, though that's everything, but by coming, by caring, by treating us like humans worth saving. The German occupation taught us we were dispensable. You've shown us we matter." Morrison didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded, and they sat together while Amsterdam's night sounds gradually resumed sounds of people who'd eaten for the first time in weeks, who believed they might survive, who were beginning to hope. Captain Mitchell worked through the night, monitoring critical patients, watching for signs of improvement or deterioration. Baby Emma stabilized around 0300, her vitals strengthening, her body responding to 4 nutrition and careful medical management. Anna van der Meer sat beside her daughter's cot, holding her tiny hand, weeping quietly with relief that was almost painful in its intensity. Mitchell touched her shoulder gently, said through a translator, "She's going to survive. She's going to be okay." The words released something in Anna, and she wept harder. Grief and relief combined into response that was too large for her exhausted body to contain. But not all the children survived that first night. 3 died before dawn, bodies too damaged, systems too far gone, relief arriving just hours or days too late to save them. Mitchell performed the medical documentation with professional discipline that barely concealed rage at the deliberate policy that had caused these deaths, at the occupation forces that had weaponized starvation, at the war that had created circumstances where children died from hunger in a nation that had once been prosperous. The parents of these children received the news with terrible resignation. They'd expected this, had watched their children dying for weeks, had hoped relief would come in time, but hadn't quite believed it possible. Their grief was enormous, but quiet, expressed through tears rather than wailing, through holding dead children one last time, through the awful recognition that they'd done everything possible, and it hadn't been enough. May brought continued food delivery, expanded operations, more distribution points throughout Western Netherlands. The initial emergency relief expanded into sustained feeding program designed to restore populations gradually to health without overwhelming digestive systems that could handle sudden abundance. The operations grew in scale and sophistication. Medical teams coordinated with distribution centers. Nutritionists advised on meal planning. Local authorities organized community kitchens where people could eat prepared food rather than trying to cook at home without fuel. Morrison's unit stayed for 2 weeks, operating distribution points, coordinating deliveries, witnessing recovery that was inspiring and heartbreaking simultaneously. People who'd been skeletal gained weight. Children began playing again. Amsterdam's streets grew less silent as life gradually returned. But the recovery was incomplete. Bodies, damaged by months of starvation, didn't heal immediately. Psychological trauma lingered long after physical health improved, and the death toll continued climbing even after food arrived, as weakest succumbed to damage already done. Anna van der Meer's family survived. Emma recovered slowly, gaining weight, beginning to move and make sounds again, transforming from barely alive to genuinely living over the course of weeks. Sophie and Peter improved more quickly, their younger, more resilient bodies bouncing back as nutrition resumed. Anna herself took longer months of starvation, had devastated her body in ways that required time and continued good nutrition to repair. But she survived, her children survived, and that was everything. She tried to thank Morrison during one of his final days at the distribution center, wanted to express gratitude that exceeded language or comprehension. She brought him a drawing Sophie had made, a picture of American soldiers bringing food, crude child's art that captured something essential about what these men had done. Morrison accepted it with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that this was an attempt to convey significance that words couldn't reach, that this child's drawing was evidence of life preserved, of future made possible, of hope restored through simple act of caring enough to help. The Dutch population embraced their liberators with intensity that exceeded normal gratitude. They understood what Americans had done, not just defeated Germany militarily, but cared enough about Dutch civilians to organize massive relief operation, to divert resources from final military offensives, to save populations they didn't have strategic obligation to preserve. That choice to value human life over pure military efficiency communicated something about American values that no propaganda could match. The final German surrender in Netherlands came May 5, 1945, and with it came full access to Western provinces, ability to expand relief operations without negotiating ceasefires, opportunity to assess the hunger winter's full impact. The official death toll was 22,000, though historians would later suggest the real number was higher deaths in isolated homes, people who died shortly after liberation from damage too extensive to reverse long-term health impacts that shortened lives years later. The operation was studied by military strategists as example of humanitarian intervention during active conflict, of negotiating with enemies for civilian relief, of balancing military objectives with moral obligations. The decision to divert resources from final military operations to feed Dutch civilians had been controversial in some quarters arguments, that scarce supplies should go to advancing armies rather than liberated populations, that Germans should be left to feed civilians they'd been starving, that humanitarian concerns should wait until military victory was complete. But Eisenhower had decided otherwise, had concluded that allowing mass starvation while Allied forces stood by with surplus food was morally unacceptable and strategically short-sighted. Saving Dutch civilians demonstrated Allied values, built post-war goodwill, proved that victory wasn't just about defeating enemies, but also about protecting principles that made victory worthwhile. The operation succeeded militarily and morally, saving tens of thousands while demonstrating that humanitarian concerns could coexist with military operations. The Dutch never forgot. The hunger winter became defining collective memory, shared trauma that shaped national identity and post-war development. The American and British relief operations became legend, stories passed down through generations about liberators who'd cared enough to save them, who'd treated Dutch lives as valuable enough to risk resources and personnel, who demonstrated that some things mattered more than military efficiency. Morrison returned home to Ohio in August 1945, combat veteran at 24, having fought across Europe and witnessed both war's destruction and liberation's hope. He'd seen friends die, had taken lives himself, had participated in violence that would haunt him for decades. But what stayed with him most clearly was those 2 weeks in Amsterdam, distributing food to starving civilians, watching children recover, being part of something that was purely about saving rather than destroying. He kept Sophie's drawing, framed it, hung it in his home office, where it remained for 53 years until his death in 1998. When visitors asked about it, he'd tell the story about the hunger winter, about distributions that saved thousands, about a little girl who'd been so close to death that her survival seemed miraculous, about her mother, who'd wept with relief that exceeded expression. The drawing wasn't artistically valuable, wasn't historically significant, but it represented something Morrison needed to remember: that even in war, mercy was possible, that soldiers could save as well as destroy, that the best part of human nature could persist through humanity's worst conflicts. Captain Mitchell stayed in military nursing, eventually specializing in nutrition and public health, her career shaped by those weeks treating starvation victims. She published papers about refeeding syndrome, about managing recovery from severe malnutrition, about long-term health impacts of childhood starvation. Her work was technical and medical, but it was driven by memories of children dying despite food arriving, of bodies too damaged to recover, of the hours or days that separated salvation from being too late. She returned to Amsterdam in 1975 for the 30th anniversary of liberation, accepting invitation from Dutch government to meet with survivors. Baby Emma was their now 30-year-old woman, healthy and thriving, mother of 2 children herself, living proof that intervention had succeeded, that the desperate efforts to save dying children had worked often enough to matter. They met awkwardly, neither quite knowing what to say. Emma remembered nothing of her near death. Mitchell remembered every detail. But Emma's presence was message enough. You saved me. Your work mattered. Thank you for caring enough to try. Anna van der Meer lived until 1992, dying at 79, having rebuilt life from hunger winter's devastation. Her husband never returned, lost somewhere in Germany during forced labor, one of thousands who disappeared into war's chaos. She raised her 3 children alone, working as seamstress, surviving through effort and community support and the determination that had carried her through 6 months of starvation. She told her children about the hunger winter, about watching them starve while being powerless to help, about the Americans who'd arrived with food just in time. She described Morrison with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints, the soldier, who helped her when she couldn't grasp the food packages, who'd made sure her daughter got medical care, who'd treated her with dignity when she was reduced to desperation. She never knew his name, never managed to contact him despite efforts, but she remembered his face, his kindness, his embodiment of mercy that had saved her family. Emma grew up knowing she'd nearly died, that her survival was miraculous, that American soldiers had saved her through intervention that was unguaranteed or inevitable, but was chosen through values that placed human life above pure military efficiency. That knowledge shaped her entire life, her career in social work helping refugees, her advocacy for humanitarian intervention, her insistence that nations had obligations to help vulnerable populations, even when doing so was inconvenient or expensive. She traveled to America in 1990, wanting to see the country that had saved her, wanting to understand Americans who'd cared enough about Dutch children to organize massive relief operation. She visited Morrison's home in Ohio, met his widow, who showed her. Sophie's drawing told her that Morrison had talked about the hunger winter relief constantly, that saving Dutch civilians had been the proudest thing he'd done in the war. Emma and Morrison's widow wept together. Two women connected by man who died 2 years earlier, but whose legacy lived in both of them. The Hunger Winter entered historical record as one of World War II's deliberate civilian atrocities, German forces weaponizing food scarcity, using starvation as collective punishment, inflicting mass death on population that had supported Allied operations. The 22,000 official deaths represented one of the war's largest civilian casualties from a single policy in a single region over a single winter. But the historical record also documented the response Operation Manna and Chalhound, the RAF and USAAF drops, the ground distributions, the medical interventions, the successful saving of hundreds of thousands who would otherwise have died. The operations became case studies in humanitarian intervention, in balancing military and moral obligations, in demonstrating that even in total war, civilians deserved protection rather than deliberate targeting. The operations influenced post-war humanitarian law, contributing to Geneva Convention expansions that addressed civilian protection, that established principles about obligations toward starving populations, that created frameworks for humanitarian access during conflicts. The experience shaped Allied occupation policies in Germany, where preventing German starvation after defeat became priority despite temptations toward retribution. Lesson learned from Dutch Hunger Winter about collective punishment's moral bankruptcy. The Dutch commemoration of the Hunger Winter and liberation became annual ritual. Ceremonies held each May, remembering those who died and thanking those who saved survivors. The generation that had starved gradually died off, but their children and grandchildren maintained the commemorations, ensuring that memory persisted, that gratitude remained vivid, that the lesson about humanitarian obligations survived beyond those who directly experienced both starvation and relief. 75 years after the Hunger Winter, Amsterdam holds ceremonies where elderly survivors share memories with descendants who never knew that suffering but inherited its lessons. They speak about starvation's reality, about the desperation of watching children die, about the Americans and British who came with food when hope had nearly disappeared. They show photographed skeletal children who survived, distribution centers where food was given, soldiers who became heroes through simple act of caring. The message isn't about military glory or dramatic rescue, but about simpler truth, that mercy matters, that civilian life has value even during war, that nations have obligations to prevent suffering when prevention is possible. The Hunger Winter demonstrated what happens when those obligations are ignored. 22,000 dead from deliberate policy. The relief operations demonstrated what happens when obligations are honored. Hundreds of thousands saved through intervention that prioritized human life over military convenience. Morrison's widow donated his papers to the National World War II Museum in 2003, and among them was a letter he'd written but never sent, composed in 1985 after reading about Hunger Winter commemorations in Netherlands. I've spent 40 years trying to reconcile what I experienced in the war, the violence necessary to defeat genuine evil, the friends lost, the lives I took in combat. The Hunger Winter relief doesn't erase any of that or make it morally clean, but it reminds me that even in war, even between enemies, choosing mercy over cruelty is possible. Those 2 weeks distributing food in Amsterdam showed me that soldiers can save as well as destroy, that militaries can serve. Humanitarian purposes, that the strength to help the vulnerable matters as much as the strength to defeat the enemy. A little girl drew me a picture to say thank you for food that saved her family. I've kept that drawing for 40 years because it represents the best thing I did in the war, not the most strategic, not the most militarily significant, but the most purely good. We fed starving children because it was right, because we could, because our values required it. That choice defines America more clearly than our military victories do. The drawing hangs in the museum now, displayed with explanation about Operation Manna and the Hunger Winter, about mass starvation and massive relief. about death and salvation, happening simultaneously in Western Netherlands during spring 1945. Visitors see the crude child's art American soldiers, food packages, a family saved, and read the story of Sophie van der Meer, who drew it at age 8 after nearly dying from starvation, who survived to raise her own children and grandchildren, who lived until 2001, that her life had been saved by Americans who'd cared enough to organize relief. Operation that wasn't strategically necessary, but was morally essential. The hunger winter killed 22,000, but would have killed hundreds of thousands more without intervention. The relief operations saved those lives not through dramatic rescue or military heroism, but through simple decision that feeding starving children mattered more than pure military efficiency, that humanitarian obligations persisted even during total war, that sometimes the most important victories were measured in lives preserved rather than enemies defeated. That lesson, simple, profound, eternally relevant, echoes forward through decades, carried by survivors and descendants, embodied in commemorations and museums, preserved in crude child's drawing that captured truth too large for sophisticated expression. Thank you for seeing that we mattered, for choosing mercy when cruelty would have been easier, for saving us when we'd nearly given up hope that anyone cared, whether we lived or died.